Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Energy Conversations podcast, the gateway for ordinary South Africans to understand South Africa's dynamic energy landscape. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and today we start our journey of exploration and enlightenment. I am honored to have with me today two distinguished guests who are revered energy experts to share their insights with you. Firstly, we have Dr. Steven Mathetsa, who is from the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. And we also have Kiren, Maharaj, the Board Chairperson of SANEA, which is the South African National Energy Association. In this debut episode, we aim to set the stage for the series by providing an overview of a cornerstone of South Africa's energy policy, the Integrated Resource Plan, a critical energy policy document currently open for public comment until 23 March 2024. Today's conversation aims to assist ordinary South Africans understand the IRP and highlights its significance and implications for ordinary South Africans. We seek to lay a foundation for engagement by South Africans with this vital policy document and empower citizens to contribute to South Africa's energy journey. But before we get into the IRP, let's start with introductions and introducing our guests. Kiren, perhaps I can start with you, and you can briefly tell me about your role in the energy sector and a bit more about SANEA.
Thank you very much, Thokozile. So I've been in the energy sector for a very long time, specifically on the power generation side. And I have to say, I've seen the industry when we had excess capacity and we didn't know what to do with it. And of course, today we're in a situation where we have significant security and adequacy challenges. So, I've been around to have seen the tides changed. My role, essentially, I've been part of the South Africa's energy utility Eskom for a very long time, mainly again in the power generation part, but also on the primary energy side as well. I've been out of Eskom for the last 10 years and in the private sector, working very much with IPPs, on the renewable energy side, but equally well, my role as the chairperson of SANEA. SANEA is the South African National Energy Association, and we turn 100 this year. So we've been around for 100 years, and you can imagine how many different tides of the sector we've seen in that period. And to remain relevant for 100 years, I think as an organization, you have to continually adapt and reinvent yourself. And by and large, we've managed to do that. One of the good things about SANEA is that we're non-partisan, so we don't prefer any technology. We call ourselves technology agnostic. And we are also drivers of critical thinking in the energy sector. And our view is really to bring together diverse perspectives, diverse experts, diverse opinions, an abundance of facts and information on which businesses, energy sector experts, and the public in general can make decisions about and choices about energy in South Africa. So this year we commemorate our 100th anniversary, and we've got a good lineup of a whole lot of events, etc. And we have a website, www.southafricannationalenergyassociation.org, and everybody's encouraged to go and look at some of the fantastic work that we do, including reports and studies in partnership with, for example, entities like the African Energy Leadership Center, so that to bring cutting-edge information to the sector.
Thank you very much, Kiren. Thank you very much. Dr. Mathetsa, perhaps you can just tell us a bit about your role in the sector and a bit more about the African Energy Leadership Center.
Yeah, thank you, Thokozile. I have been with the energy industry for quite some time. I've also been with Eskom But I think when I joined ESCOM, I think it was 12 years ago, Kiren was still there. So I worked for ESCOM, and I've also been to various industries in the mining sector. I've also worked for the logistics Transnet, and I've been with the African Energy Leadership Center for the past 6 months. Or this is my 5th month, by the way. And our role there is just to ensure that there's some sufficient teaching and research that is still the latest thinking, best practices within the energy leadership system. As Kiren has mentioned, that there's been a lot of changes within the energy sector recently. South Africa's energy landscape is changing effectively. So it's very important that from the teaching and research side as well, we are up to par with the latest development across the globe and ensure that we enforce them or embed them or try to teach them across various societies of the community. So that is basically our role. And the center has been established. It's been since 2017 that it was operating.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to you both. And thank you again for joining us for this very important conversation. So let's get straight into the IRP and let's dig in. Perhaps, Kiren, I can start with you in just explaining what is the main goal of the Integrated Resource Plan and why is the IRP crucial for South Africa's energy sector?
You know, the IRP is a key policy document for the energy sector, and there is other approaches to looking at a more consolidated view on energy in terms of integrated energy planning. But from an integrated resource perspective, it focuses specifically on the choices that we need to make as far as power generation for the production of electricity is concerned. So what it really does is it makes an assumption about the demand for electricity, so what's going to be consumed, and looks at, given the current energy options that you have based on different technologies, what is the future plan that you need to put in place to produce the amount of electricity that's going to be consumed. So I think that's kind of like a one-liner, you know, it's a plan that matches energy demand and energy supply. And when I say energy, I'm referring to power generation. So the one, you know, the plan is very, very critical to the sector, but like with every plan, it is only as valid as the information that it has. And the information that it has is probably one of the big challenging areas. So if you look at some of the inputs, assumptions that are being used, they have been produced quite some time ago, considering that the plan is only being produced in 2024. And by the time all the public consultation processes, etc., take place, we're probably looking at this plan being officially launched in the second half of the year. But by the time it's launched, the information already gets outdated. And I think that's one of the big challenges. And for me, one of the significant issues that we're dealing with in this specific IRP is that this IRP has been done under some very big evolutionary changes that have come about in the energy sector. So, you know, the launch of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program, bringing in independent players to build power generation options. Then we've had the big change that we've seen, partly driven by the need to mitigate load shedding, which was around reducing the licensing limit for capacity to under 100 megawatts, which has really significantly encouraged self-generation and embedded generation that is now not in control of the utility. So it's all becoming very decentralized. And I think the challenge starts to become, how do you produce a central plan in an evolving decentralized energy system, but still have data that is of, you know, high quality and highly predictable to be able to make the choices that you have. But having said that, you know, both in decentralized and centralized energy systems, resource planning plays a key role, not just informing energy sector players how the energy sector is going to evolve and what kind of choices need to be made, but I think it has far-reaching benefits for, you know, other aspects of growing the economy and making sure that the economy is underpinned by secure energy supply.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And maybe as a follow-on and in positioning this document for ordinary South Africans to understand, a key development since the 2019 IRP was also the implementation of the Energy Action Plan. So where does that action plan then fit in with the IRP? Is it different? Do they speak to each other? What's the intention behind those two documents?
So they are different. In fact, they're quite fundamentally different. So the process that culminated in the Energy Action Plan was the launch of the National Energy Crisis Committee by the President. I think it was in the second half of 2022, July, August, if I remember correctly. And that was really to address and support and give some additional direction to Eskom and other related entities in solving some of the challenges in the energy sector that was leading to load shedding. So one of the biggest aspects of the Energy Action Plan is addressing the performance of the power generation fleet. But equally well, there are some aspects of unblocking and facilitating of business decisions and choices that need to be made in the renewable sector with regard to the development of the transmission grid. And although some of the issues that the Energy Action Plan is focusing on is longer term, like, for example, the development of the transmission grid, a lot of the actions and the focus of the Energy Action Plan is on the short term. So what do we do to support Eskom and other critical entities to facilitate actions that can improve plant performance as we see it, but also encourage self-generation, mitigating risks for small businesses, industries, etc., around not having a secure energy supply. Now, the link to the IRP is that one of the key assumptions that the IRP makes is around the availability of the existing power generation fleet. And obviously, if the action plan is highly successful in delivering its outcomes in a quick time, you may even find that the assumptions are perhaps understated around plant availability, but equally well, if there's further deterioration of the performance, which may or may not be directly attributable to the Energy Action Plan, you could find that we are more short of capacity than we actually think.
Thank you very much for that very valuable insight. Dr. Mathetsa, I want to bring you in here and just again in positioning the IRP from a South African perspective, but also perhaps from a global perspective. Are there similar energy plans in other countries, or is this kind of plan, this integrated resource plan, is it quite unique to South Africa?
Look, Thokozile, I don't think the IRP system is unique to South Africa. I'm speaking under correction, obviously. Perhaps Kiren might come in here. I think every country has got its own energy policies and plans that are being developed in order to address the electricity demand and supply in those countries. It could be the approaches that are different. For example, the approaches that South Africa is taking in terms of developing this IRP might be different from the other countries, but generally every country has got their own policies that are there in order to address the energy demand and supply in those countries.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And then, in terms of the plan and the comment that I've made that it's open for public comment. So how would you say ordinary South Africans can actually engage with this IRP? What would you, as an ordinary South African, what do I go about? What does it mean to me? What do I do with the document? How can I, as an ordinary South African, engage with it?
Look, I think firstly, Thokozile, let me just mention that it's a constitutional right for everyone within the site to be afforded an opportunity to raise their views on important policies such as this plan. The document has been made available to the DMRE, Department of Mineral Resources website, which is the custodian of the development of the IRP. And it is also good that I've learned that the document has been made available in various languages in order to ensure that it reaches various communities, or like, for example, it's available in Nguni languages, and it's also available in Xitsonga. And however, one might argue that there are many communities, especially those that are situated in the rural areas, that does not have sufficient knowledge about the IRP and how do they actually, firstly, the accessibility of resources to ensure that they've got access to the IRP might be a challenge for them to engage with the document. And secondly, they don't have the knowledge. They might be lacking some insight knowledge in terms of the energy generating technology or systems. And I don't think that those kind of rural communities might be able to raise their concerns or air their views on this important document. And that is where opportunity comes for civil society or civil organizations to try and assist those communities in order to ensure that they conduct various public platforms in order to ensure that they share the knowledge and get the views of those various communities. And we must also know that what has been happening, what I've been observing, I might be wrong, is that most of this most of these workshops are being held online. So you can imagine somebody that is sitting in some of the Ezilaleni in Eastern Cape. How can that particular person be part of a public participation in such an important document? So I agree that the document is being made available, but what comes out is that how many people can be able to access and comment on that particular document? How many public participation processes that the custodians of this document are having with marginalized communities in order to get their perspective on how can they address the energy securities in the country. So that is something that comes out from in terms of ordinary South African engaging with the document.
Thank you. And I think you've raised some very important points, given the wide demographic of people we have in this country, and very often we position information in the assumption of the privilege to access to adequate data, privilege to access to adequate electricity, but forgetting the fact that a large part of our population does not have that privilege. So are we then saying because you don't have those privileges, you cannot participate? And I guess what we would then hope is with the DMRE having extended the period for public comment, because initially the anticipated period had been for 23rd of February. And with an additional month having been added, what we can then hope and what we can then kind of assume or hope is that the department would take some of these comments or some of these insights on board and ensure that in this additional month that's then been afforded to the public to participate, that they are then going out there and getting that participation from the actual, from members of the public that perhaps have not had an opportunity to engage the document up until this point. Kiren, I just want to come back to you and just some points that you'd made earlier, noting that some of the assumptions that were used in the IRP were actually aged. And I was wondering, could you maybe just expand on, some of these, what are these assumptions that you're referring to, just in framing what that means for an ordinary South African, and in terms of how this IRP is being put together? If you could just map out what are the input assumptions that are taken into account in developing an IRP. And I think what you also touched on when you're speaking, for example, around some of the transmission lines, those are, key factors that I guess were taken into account when reviewing the IRP, and taking into account that there has been a lag in the construction of the necessary transmission lines. I think we need about 14,000 kilometers by 2032. So if you could maybe just expand on some of these key factors and also expand on the input assumptions that were taken into account.
Thank you. Before I do that, maybe I just want to add to the conversation on, how does the general public comment on the IRP. So there is an opportunity to submit written comments, and I think as part of the IRP document, an email address is given. So that's, worst case scenario, if you cannot engage in any platform or any other conversation, I think it would be great to use that opportunity to comment. But I think one of the better conduits to making comments would be for communities, etc., to engage through civil organizations, like Steven said. And it would also, I think, assist with, contextualizing comments and the information in the IRP, so that the relevance of what needs to be said is directed, in the right way. So I think those are probably the two best opportunities to do this. Mm-hmm. Just coming back to the issue of the assumptions, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions in the IRP, as you would imagine. We say it's a matching of demand and supply. And that sounds a lot more simplistic than it actually is, because, first and foremost, you need to produce a demand forecast. Now, Eskom supplies electricity. It is a central grid. So, we through the Eskom information, you can access demand, but there's so much going on in the scenes. Every day we hear of, I think the number is now like the 50,000 megawatt pipeline of private projects that are being built by big and small industries. Every day, somebody's putting a new solar PV installation on their rooftop. And to keep track of all of this information, I think it's quite a challenge at this point in time. We really don't have the systems to do all of that. So an entity like SAPVIA, the South African PV Association, they have, a monitor, a little indicator on their website as to how many private projects have been registered with the regulator. And it's currently sitting at over 6,000. And then from the sale of solar PV panels, an estimate has been made of, how much of rooftop solar PV there is. So there's no concrete information, no portal that, every one of us is putting this information to. And I think that is one of the big challenges in this environment of AI and big data and digitization. Is there a different way to do this, that we make demand a bit more real time? And, what ability and which organ has the ability to perhaps engage in more detail with big industry, etc., to understand their plans for the longer term. The other one is the power plant performance, and together with that goes, for example, like the decommissioning plan, the plan to commission new capacity, etc. And I think those are much easier to coordinate because it's fewer entities. So on the power plant performance, you're generally looking at the performance from the IPP sector and Eskom being the majority still in terms of power generation. So you've got like a one-stop shop. But I mean, at this point in time, we've seen that the power plant performance is way below expectations. In fact, that's one of the big differences between the previous IRP and this IRP, to the tune of over 20%, more than 20% change in that assumption, which fundamentally has a big impact on what the outcomes would be. The other big input is the decommissioning plan, and that plan was really around decommissioning coal-fired power plant, not only from an age perspective, but also from, the decarbonization requirements. And we've seen a big change in the decommissioning program, and some of it is related to keeping the network secure. I don't have facts, but a lot of the off-grid supply that's coming on board is not necessarily with storage. So the nighttime requirement for these entities still has to be met by Eskom, which means that the baseload requirement for our power system is still very much intact. And the current coal fleet is one of the easiest ways, or one of the most feasible ways, despite their poor performance at this point in time, to meet that requirement. So if you wanted to match demand and supply, and you're still having a full profile of demand, if you decommission all the coal plants, you've got big gaps. And the question is, can you fill those gaps timelessly without resulting in further load shedding? So, the other issue with the decommissioning plan is obviously the whole aspect of decarbonization and the energy transition does have a huge impact on job losses, stranding communities, etc. And in as much as there's a lot of studies and a lot of work being undertaken, I don't think the key issues have been addressed. So there's still communities, people, employees, etc., with big questions around their future. There's a survival in the future, and those haven't been addressed. So, while we've got the need for environmental justice, I mean, I think social justice and human justice and that kind of thing are also equally important for consideration, and not all of those boxes have been ticked. So there are some other, options, and I think one of the big one is which technologies are you going to choose and what the costs of these technologies are. And it's very interesting, every fraternity has different opinions about these. There's so many different studies at play, and I sometimes pity the DMRE for the one that they're going to choose. And it is what it is. When you choose it, that is the one you're going to use. But that in itself gets a bit dated, and economic trends are emerging on a day-to-day basis. The global effect of prices, especially things linked to commodity prices and exchange rates, etc., it's always up and down. So it's very hard to pin that down. But at a point you need to put a peg in the ground and make a choice.
Thank you for that. I think it also speaks to the fact that
in the time that's lapsed between the IRP, because the initial one was 2010 to 2019 to now 2023, and given the fact that the IRP is supposed to be this living document that's fluid and that moves and is able to be agile enough to address these changes, that is perhaps the challenge in the drafting and the challenge in getting the IRP out timelessly. And that's probably something that needs to be addressed. And I think, Kiren, just you made a really good point in terms of technology choices, and I'd like to bring in Dr. Mathetsa here in terms of speaking around how does the IRP determine South Africa's sources and technology choices? Does it do that, or if so, how does it do it? What is taken into account in the final allocation of technology that's being proposed?
Thank you, Thokozile. Well, firstly, I must say that we must acknowledge that South Africa is on a crossroads in terms of technologies that are available for energy generation. For many decades, we've been a country that has heavily relied on coal. And now, based on some of the global and local developments, we have to bring in a different mix, an energy that can be able to ensure that our energy is affordable and can also be able to improve our energy availability, and most importantly, the efficiency of those technologies also bring into mind. So I'm mentioning three things: the availability of that technology, the affordability of that technology, and the efficiency of that technology. And obviously, taking into consideration the environmental friendliness of that particular technology, it plays a very, very much important role in terms of selecting that technology for present and future times. But it's unfortunate that at the moment there's been a lot of debates as to which technology is much affordable and efficient for South Africa's country as diverse as South Africa. For an example, like as I mentioned, that we have heavily relied on coal for quite some time, and the prices were affordable at that particular time. But today, the availability of those coal-fired power plants, it's something that is being brought into the discussion to say these coal-fired power plants are not as available as we thought they should be. I mean, the current situation that we're at in terms of load shedding, it brings the dimension of a technology choice into the discussion. And one other element that has been brought into the energy mix in terms of the choices is the gas that has been mentioned in the IRP 2019, and in the current IRP it's also being mentioned as one of the potential energy sources. However, you know that as much as we have acknowledged that there's a need for gas to be brought into the energy mix, there's been some backlashes from various entities or civil organizations in order to assess the suitability of gas within South Africa's energy mix. And perhaps that is why today there's few litigations that are happening across the country regarding the gas issue. And also the issue of renewables comes into the picture, wind and solar. Some people will still argue that these are quite expensive technologies, and reliability as well, availability of these technologies also comes into the discussion. So it's quite a difficult position for South Africa. So we have to look at various elements before we can have a proper energy mix. So the affordability for me, the affordability has to come into the picture to say each and every ordinary South African has to be able to afford that electricity. And availability as well, as I mentioned, that it has to be available at all the times. You know, nowadays with this the load shedding, how it disrupts people's living, and also the efficiency as well. It's quite important for the IRP in order to acknowledge these three elements.
Could you maybe just expand around what are currently in the proposed IRP? What are the sources that are currently forecasted that South Africa would need to rely on?
Currently, on paper, I would say that I see a fair energy mix, taking into consideration some of the technicalities around energy supply. Like for an example, as I mentioned earlier on, that we have heavily relied on coal. Coal is still part of the energy source that will, like as indicated in the IRP, that between now and 2030, we'll still rely on coal. As Kiren has mentioned, that now there are plans to expand the lifespan of those particular coal power plants, and also the issue of renewable energy, solar and wind, comes much into the mix. These programs that the government has been running, the renewable energy procurement process, they also bring some comfort in terms of ensuring that renewable energy is being considered into the country's energy mix, and it's also mentioned in the IRP. And also, as I mentioned as well, the issue of gas, it comes back again in this IRP. I think IRP 2019, it mentioned about I just don't remember the numbers, but I think it was about 1,800 megawatt of gas. But now that number has been increased, and also the acceleration of bringing gas into the mix as well. This seems to have been brought forward. I think in the IRP 2019 they were talking about 2028, but now they're talking about 2027 or so. And also nuclear energy is also being brought back into the mix. The procurement process is being talked about in terms of procuring 2,500 megawatts of nuclear. And there's some hydro power plant, of which it's also part of the proportion, although we know that as a water scarce country, you also need to be very cautious of how do we put much reliance on hydropower. So those are some of the key technologies that are being advocated into the IRP.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Kiren, if I can come back to you and just talking around timelines, when will we actually see the change? How will this, when will this demand be met? The IRPs envisions 2 horizons that they were looking at. Could you maybe expand a bit on this 2-pronged horizon approach, and what are the timelines that are actually being looked at in terms of meeting the energy demand?
Let me just start with the second part, the horizon part. So I think we can all appreciate that in an environment where we've got this big challenge of load shedding to deal with, and if you really think about it, if you got a significant turnaround in Eskom's plant performance, it would bring a big portion of capacity onto the grid, which then may result in a standard capacity in terms of if you went quickly and, for example, deployed more energy options. The challenge with that is, to maximize the benefit from renewable energy sources, you have to let them run when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing. If you don't, you waste the energy unless you can store it. So if you had a big improvement in Eskom's performance, you'd be sitting with the plant that you've spent all this money and time improving the performance of not running, because you've deployed this large amount of renewables and solar PV, renewable energy in the form of solar and wind that has to run when it needs to. So you're going to have to pull this plant back. That's just one of the complexities. I mean, the other complexity is the plant performance stays the same. You still have a big base load, the energy consumption profile still largely remains base load. And then you've got the renewable energy plant without storage that is what we call non-dispatchable. So it runs when the resources are available, not necessarily when you need it, so without a storage element. So you've got to deal with a lot of these complexities while it's almost like dancing on a flying carpet. So I think the idea of breaking this up in 2 horizons is a good idea, with the shorter term up to about 2030, when we're really looking at fixing the issues around plant performance, mitigating load shedding, bringing back a high level of energy security into our economy, but then also leaving our options open for new technologies, etc., to come into play. And I think that's where Horizon 2, the different energy pathways, comes in. And the DMRE has asked specifically for comments from the public and the energy sector in general as to whether they are the way they've considered the pathways are adequate and sufficient, or whether there's other pathways that need to come in. So, we talk about a green hydrogen economy. We talk about green hydrogen for storage. I think that game still needs to play out. We've gone now down the route of self-generation and embedded generation. We don't really know what the complete uptake for it would be, because the driver for embedded and self-generation is not only load shedding. It's also companies that they themselves have to demonstrate ESG compliance through decarbonization. So they want to diversify the sources of their energy consumption for themselves. We know there's gas in the region. We know there's nuclear potential. So there's a lot of cards at play here. And I think, all the hands haven't fallen as yet. So allowing ourselves the opportunity to carve out different pathways, based on some very concrete factors that we need to start considering is, I think, quite a nifty way of addressing the short-term challenges and then looking at the longer term differently. But the big challenge is going to be creating synergies around what these possible pathways could be. And there's no question about the link between what you deliver in Horizon 1 and what you eventually carve out as your pathways in Horizon 2. So it's not almost like, let's see what happens in Horizon 1 and then Horizon 2 comes into play. I think both of it has to move at the same pace with regard to the intensity of implementation for both parts of it to be successful. I think from a timeline perspective, we know that the industry has shown us that the renewable energy options are very easily deployable. The construction time is not long, but there's lots of other constraints in the supply chain. So, for example, all of the challenges we're having on the logistics side with port constraints, the conditions of the roads, the inefficiency of the rail network, generally the goods required or the items required for the construction of these plants land at the ports and they must be moved inland. So logistics is a big lever in making, the timelines efficient. I think some of the other challenges is the extent of time for regulatory approvals, such as environmental authorization, water use license, etc. There's obviously the big socio-economic issues that private developers are having to deal with, them coming into communities, expectations in communities. We're in an election year. I think we can expect some volatility in certain areas, and that all of which impacts the timelines for projects. So yes, renewable energy options have generally a much quicker timeline. We're not looking at 10 or 12 years for it to be deployed, but equally well, that needs to be an efficient value chain to deliver these outcomes. I think there are some concerns that some of the scenarios in the IRP don't actually match demand and supply. So even after the running of the scenarios we shot, those are some of the things that are going, will need to be looked at. And I think in terms of, the way the IRP is currently structured, one of the big concerns from a decarbonization perspective is that the NDC, that, the nationally determined contributions to carbon reduction that South Africa has made, the commitments that South Africa has made are only achieved until 2025, and thereafter it starts to decline. So it obviously then means when we're looking at Horizon 2, we're going to have to give some significant additional thought to how South Africa responds to the decarbonization requirements.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kiren. And maybe just to give more context around the two horizons for the general public, the IRP anticipates two horizons. Horizon 1 looks at the scenario up until 2030, and the primary focus is energy security. And then this Horizon 2 then looks at the time period from 2031 to 2050, which then obviously gives us all of these different pathways. And that also speaks to considering climate change and environmental and sustainability factors as well into those considerations.
Emerging technologies, etc.
Perfect. And then maybe, Dr. Mathetsa, I think it's a good time to then considering and picking up on the points that Kiren made now. What are the potential obstacles to successfully implementing this IRP? I mean, we've got great plans in South Africa, but what could hinder the ability of this plan translating into something viable and actually working out?
Firstly, I must mention that one of the obstacles that we are likely to have is the pushback from some communities that do not want to move to a certain technology that is mentioned in the IRP. For example, I've mentioned the issue of the proposed gas procurement processes that are in place. However, there's already a lot of pushbacks and litigations that are happening, people presenting arguments that either the procurement process has not been done properly, or there's some elements of gas that does not necessarily help us move away from the cleaner technologies. So it's one of the elements that we really have to look into in terms of procuring technologies such as gas, and also the expansion of the proposed expansion of the lifespan of the power plants. I think technically we have already observed that most of these power plants are not giving us energy in the pace or in the efficiency that they're supposed to be giving us. For example, the breakdowns that are happening, it's something that can, the projected megawatts within the IRP might not be able to reach that particular projection because our plants keep on breaking up. And also, we have not really dealt with the issue of investing into the new technology, into the clean coal technology. As much as we want to expand the lifespan of these power plants, what are we doing in order to ensure that we implement the cleaner technology? Like, for example, the carbon capture and storage technologies. To what extent do we have to research that and ensure that when we keep the coal-fired power plants running, how do we ensure that we deal with the issue of carbon? Because obviously, based on the current IRP, we're still going to rely much on coal. But to what extent do we invest in the clean coal technology such as carbon capture and storage in terms of the research and the development of those technologies? So I think those are some of the obstacles that we might really have to encounter. We might encounter as we try to implement this document.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And then maybe one more, Kiren, like I think something to also consider is from a localization perspective or any opportunities for the local economy, because I think you spoke quite a bit around, those value chains that need to potentially be strengthened for some technologies actually to be viable. And I guess the broad question would be, does the IRP actually address or can it address job creation in South Africa, and how could we see localization doing that?
Two things. So I think obviously not directly in the IRP. That's not really what it's intended for. It sets kind of a blueprint, and it's then left for the various fraternities in industry to take this blueprint and use it to look at what are the different requirements across different aspects of what is going to be built in South Africa. So as SANEA, we last year in partnership with the Wits, the the Research in Education and Labor, and the African Energy Leadership Center, as well as the GIZ and the EWCETA, we've actually produced an energy skills roadmap. It's available for free on the SANEA website. And it really looks at, if we're going to go through the just energy transition with all the changes we're talking about, the emergence of different technologies, the different types of functions that people are going to have to perform in the energy sector going forward, what would be the skills requirement for South Africa? And it makes recommendations around what are some of the things we need to put in place right now to make sure that when the time comes, we have adequately transitioned and accelerated the production of local skills. And it's a critical issue. I mean, we sit in a country with over 60% of youth unemployed. The energy sector is an aggressive sector. It's a very fundamental sector to economic growth. And we have to have plans in place to harness these opportunities. So that is where the IRP, for example, plays a big role. If it says we need X amount of capacity, whether the private sector is building it or the public sector is building it, we would have lost as a nation if we haven't sufficiently capacitated our local resources to participate in this program. And I think that is what all of us in the sector, in this country, should be driving for. The second aspect around the localization is, when the IRP, the Renewable Energy Power Producers Program started more than 10 years ago, the first 3 rounds went, efficiently, effectively, and it started to spark interest to create assembly for solar panels in the country. There was a wind tower manufacturing capability. Companies invested heavily in building civil capability to execute on the work. More installation, more maintenance entities were starting to emerge. And then we had this big hiatus in the program, and no private investor is going to sit and wait many, many years for these projects to evolve. So we need to start using this IRP, as wrong as it may be. Now, it's not fundamentally wrong. It's probably a little bit wrong. And the challenge in any plan is to make it as less wrong as you possibly can, right? So we need to take the basis of what is in this plan to say, okay, now what can we do with it? If we're going to build so much of solar PV, let's look at rekindling local manufacture. You know, if there's a need for support for nuclear, what services do we need for nuclear? You know, what services do we need to become a country that runs gas power plant? Because there's different aspects of quality, safety, etc., that are required for the different technologies. So it gives you the opportunity to set up businesses that can provide the services. And if you've now addressed the skills issue, then you've also brought in local resources to provide the services. So I think once you have an input document like the IRP, you then need solid thinking on industrialization that comes out of this kind of planning to move the economy forward and addresses the key economic issues, growing the economy, employing people, you know, creating industrialization, demand side markets, supply side markets, and of course, you know, contributing to human beings becoming more prosperous. I think that is where a document like the IRP plays a role. And we mustn't fall into the trap of continuously debating whether it's right or wrong. We must actually look at what are some of the key fundamental messages that are coming out of it and how those can be leveraged to move the sector and the economy forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think it's the document we have, and it's the document that we need to find a way to work with in a way that will actually stimulate economic growth for South Africa, but also ensuring that we're dealing with the energy crisis that we're currently experiencing. Maybe a last one to you, Dr. Mathetsa, and a question that I think any ordinary South African would be wondering after all of this after everything that we've been saying around the IRP, like, will ordinary South Africans feel the impact of the changes that are proposed in the IRP in their daily lives? And I guess a simple question, does the IRP impact household electricity costs?
Look, I think there's one thing that every ordinary South African might want to see at the moment, and that is why action plans such as the NICOM and this IRP are in place. Energy availability, it's very important. If we can get energy available at all the times, it will obviously everyone will feel a positive impact, because that can be able to stimulate a lot of things. I mean, can be able to stimulate the job market and industries and any other activities that heavily rely on energy. Remember, at the moment we talk about the fact that we have managed to make electricity access to over 90% of the population, but well, that is when we compare to what happened in 1994 when we had almost 34%. But it's the availability that matters most. You know, it's the availability of electricity that will make sure that the small medium industries are being able to operate as and when needed. Is the ability that availability that can be able to make sure that there's job in the markets, and issues that is such as water supply, job creation, and the health issues are being addressed. So the most important thing for me, I think at the moment, is the availability of electricity, and that is where I would rely on a document such as this to say, as Kiren has mentioned earlier on, to say localization as well is quite important, especially if you bring in new energy pathways into the system. How do you ensure that local communities or ordinary South Africans have got opportunities in those new pathways? And that is also quite important. And the other thing that I can also mention is that the implementation plans has to ensure that they align to the current conditions of the ordinary South Africans. If there's going to be any other implementation plan that comes out of this IRP, they must make sure that they align to the need of the South African. That is quite important for me. And in terms of the pricing, I think pricing are mostly impacted by the technologies, and that is something that I mentioned earlier on to say there's some argument to say one price prices from various technologies impact the cost of various technologies impact on the price for various households, of which, South Africa, we've got a standard price for electricity. So it's something that NERSA has to really look into, to say to what extent do we regulate the pricing as we bring in new energy pathways that might come costly at some point. To what extent do we regulate the pricing? And obviously, we know that for the past 10 years or so, there's been a huge escalation of electricity prices in the country, and it has obviously impacted on affordability of electricity to various household, especially the marginalized. So it's very important that NERSA put an eye on the pricing of the electricity to ensure that it's properly regulated, and everyone should be able to afford the electricity. That is basically one of the fundamentals of the IRP, to ensure that the electricity remain affordable in the country.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for your time and for your great participation in this podcast. And that brings us to the end of our inaugural episode of the Energy Conversations podcast. I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to our esteemed guests, our first guests, Dr. Mathetsa and Kiren Maharaj, for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise. And today we really starts at the journey to attempting to demystify the South African energy landscape and empowering ordinary South African citizens. And I would ask that South Africans join us next time as we continue with our exploration. Until then, remember, the power to change our energy future lies within each of us. Thank you for tuning in, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe, and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.